I would like to welcome everyone here and those who have been viewing this who will be viewing it outside the State Library. Besides myself, and I'm the Senior Librarian here in Family History and part of a unit that has been developing specialist services for 17 odd years plus, with information guides, workshops and services, we have John Graham. And I would imagine almost everybody would know him because he is famous from the Ryerson Index. He certainly contributed significantly to our being able to find things. He's been actively involved in genealogy since starting to research his own family in 1975. He subsequently became increasingly interested in local history, particularly the area of the south coast of New South Wales, centred on the town of Gerringong, do you say it that way? He's written 5 books on aspects of local history and co-authored a 6th. From 1998 until 2005, he was head of the Sydney Dead Persons Society. That is a real name. I was once spoken to that I was to take things seriously and not talk about the Dead Persons Society, but my understanding it was people who were interested in computers and genealogy. And during that time, the DPS was founded the Ryerson Index, and that's something that I think if you don't know about, you'll be very interested to hear about. And I certainly had the staff saying, we want you to make sure you come back with all the extra things we don't know. If you are interested in extra information, there are flyers outside if you want to stay in touch. There's also information about our talk next month on the 2nd of August, as well as there being information sheets. We're going to need to get started, I'd say, pretty well quickly. And so I'm obviously going to be concentrating on the State Library collection. So what I want you to become aware of is the range of newspapers we have here. It is the most significant collection of Queensland newspapers. And I want to look at the types of notices and articles available, to consider digitised newspapers and their benefits, to look at links between the newspapers and other sources, and to look at various indexes, which may be relevant to some of you who have already been asking about newspapers which aren't on Trove or which go beyond the limits of the Trove dates. So what do we have? Well, on microfilm, we have an extensive range of historical newspapers for Queensland and northern New South Wales, because it's really basically part of Queensland. The major Australian dailies, such as The Age, Sydney Morning Herald, and so on, as well as selected overseas newspapers. We also provide online access to an increasing range of papers which can be searched by keywords. They can be searched online and Australia-wide, and this is where we know about Trove. Is there anyone here who doesn't know about Trove? Aren't you brave putting up your hands when we're all getting excited? However, if you want additional help in this, I'd also suggest that you go up to level 3 at the end of this so you can find out a bit more. We've also got overseas British newspapers online via the 19th century British newspapers, the British Newspaper Archive and the Times Digital Archive. So that's quite a selection, and it connects to the areas most of us are interested in. So how do you find out if we've got what you want? You can check our online catalogue at home or on site. You don't need a library card to do that. We've also got finding aids that sit up on the desk, looking for newspapers by place and by title. And we have an information sheet, which I haven't handed out today because you've got a more detailed sheet. And then when all else fails, or just ask the staff, they're there to provide a service. Someone's asked about lost newspapers. The library's always looking for those lost newspapers because you're always looking for them, as we've already learnt today. And they're some of the ones, and they're from Aramac, Copperfield, Gladstone, and so on. In many cases, small runs, but very significant runs. So don't ever have anyone say, these are just old newspapers, I'm throwing them out. There's a huge thing on to discard, hoarders and clutterers and saying they have mental health issues. Well, we love those people when it comes to newspapers. We want them to let us know all about them. Okay, old newspapers can be obviously very valuable, and that's one of the reasons many of you have come here today, because it's got information about people which may be found nowhere else. And it also provides us with clues, sometimes just simply to direct us elsewhere. Some of the notices, and as you realise, we're heavily into death here, and there's going to be a big emphasis on it today, because funeral and death notices, as well as obituaries, are very useful sources of information about individuals and about their families. Likewise, marriage notices, golden and diamond wedding anniversaries, which often bring together people's lives in an interesting roundup. Other material which can be found include accidents and inquests, crime and punishment, shipping intelligence, that is reports on ships coming in and matters associated with it, personal and social notices, and some very useful online searching options. Obituaries. Very often they have been an invaluable source of information. They can also provide quite incorrect information. And, of course, we all know that it's a woman's right to decide on her age according to the occasion. If you haven't learnt that, you soon will, but they're not the only ones. So it can give you the age and birthplace of the deceased, members of their family and their spouse or spouses may be named, the number of years they've been in an area, so that again provides you with somewhere else you might like to look, or the period of time over which it's reasonable to look, as well as their occupations. And of course we all know that if you're a seaman you were only ever a captain and so forth. So we always need to take a healthy dose of scepticism. It can also show us how they were involved in community events and things which happened in their lives which were important to them or others. And something for which we're always looking is if they are immigrants, on what ship did they arrive? We know they didn't swim, we just can't find them. Now this is an obituary from the Queensland Times, which is actually in the process of going up onto Trove. Most of these things we've found through the long, hard slog of sitting on a microform machine. I was asked to find the obituary of John Mackenzie. There was no shipping list that we had, but the person who requested this knew when he arrived. We looked for his obituary and we found the ship named. We also got all of those personal details about his age, date of birth, etc. But there'd been something I'd been looking for years, which I picked up quite incidentally, which if this were on Trove, I might have been able to pick up, and that is the arrival of F.D.G. Stanley, our second colonial architect. We've had a few people pursuing this for years, and when we looked at the list of the Ocean Chief, it said there was a Frank Stanley, 22 years of age, a labourer. The newspapers also put him in the second cabin. Now we know that Francis Drummond Greville Stanley would never have arrived as a labourer. But we were pretty well 95% certain that it was him. It had just been incorrectly recorded. And here it is, not as part of his obituary, but as part of somebody else's. But note, he's down as FSG. It's a very minor thing, but sometimes it throws people, and it means you need to search a bit more widely at times to be sure. Now, someone like FDG Stanley's quite famous, and it's not hard to confirm it, but sometimes it can be. So we need to look at a range of evidence. Here we have an interesting character, James Charles Beale, who was a government printer, the state government printer. And remember, we actually have pictures of people that you can find through Trove, which will pick up the state library images and images from elsewhere. Now, he gave evidence before committees, and that's a wonderful index we have for hearing people speak directly to you. And in the printery, he was very concerned about the fact that women should not be paid the same as men, even if they could read as well. So it was a great comfort to read here that in his heyday, he was an enthusiastic supporter of all the manly sports. It takes on a certain ring when you read this evidence that he gave. It also gives us his entire background of where he was born in Sydney, how he did his apprenticeship at the Sydney Morning Herald, where he was educated when he came to Brisbane. And there's the full drama of his death. He was attacked by influenza. It looked as if he was getting better, but he died. So they can be very interesting. We've got a lot of personal information there, and information that fills out someone who is actually not only an important person, but an interesting personality in his own right. This is another one. This is one that actually came as a question from Victoria, along with the fact that this lady said to us, all my family came into Victoria, but she married so quickly after arrival that she could only have arrived through Queensland. Now, very often when people did come in, they can be found on the New South Wales and Victorian lists, but not on the Queensland ones. And this was the case with Caroline Murray. She came with her 2 sons, and according to, it lists both of her husbands. She was a Wallace. She married a Charles Favell IV Wordsworth. And then when she came to Queensland, very promptly married a William Murray. It lists her children from the first marriage and from the second marriage. So we have a lot of information, but it gives us an incorrect year. It says she came in 1879. When we look at the list, we see that she came in 1880, and we could only find her on the Victorian list at the time. We would no doubt find her on the New South Wales list, but, we were looking online at this stage. We can't find her on a Queensland list. So that obituary was a very valuable lead. Death and funeral notices can provide details missing from a death certificate. Notices are intended for friends and family, not for government officials. There are a lot of people who are very suspicious of the government. The Irish were in particular, and they provided no more than they needed to do. Now, one of the banes of my life, of course, are the Irish names. Not only do they all seem to have a very limited range of surnames, but the same range of first names. And here we have the death of Honora Ryan. Note that she's down as Laura. There is information here which tells us she's the right one, though, because of her husband's name, because of her address. But there is information here that is not on the death certificate, and that is the townland, the smallest unit of land in Ireland. You need that in order to find somebody. And it tells us that she's formerly of the townland Ballygurteen, Parish Kilmoyla. What does it say on her death certificate? Just Tipperary. What is the most common name in Tipperary? Ryan. How many Honoras are there? Walk down the cemetery, aisles and see all the Noras and Honoras and whatever. So that provided the critical information which picked out where that family came from. Now, this is another interesting one. This is from the Maryborough Chronicle, a Mr. August Fuchs. He, in fact, went overseas, came back, visited people in Adelaide and died. Now, these are the bane of our lives, people who go away on holidays and die. And we've all got them. And sometimes they just get over the Queensland border. But he'd come back And the Maryborough Chronicle has reported it. He's died at Adelaide. The article appeared 11 days before the burial. He was obviously going to be buried in Maryborough, and so the body had to be embalmed. And obviously the Maryborough Chronicle needed to report this because it gives us the exact date of death, and that's not on the South Australian indexes, so that's extremely useful. It also gives us all the details of the embalming. So we know who did it, Mr. J. Ammenhauser. It was picked up by Mr. J. Ammenhauser. It was embalmed by R.T. Wallman. The coffin is of English oak, mounted in silver and plush. We've been asked to state that on being opened, the body was found to be in a perfect state of preservation, reflecting very creditably on the embalmers. Any friends wishing to see the remains of the deceased may do so up to 2 o'clock this afternoon. So you don't know what you're going to find out about your family. Marriage notices and articles, are also of value because they give the names of the bride and groom, the residence, place of birth, names of the parents of both parties, name of the church, and in some cases wedding photos, especially in the 20th century. They may take a long time to be published. You need to consider other districts where the families may have had links. We sometimes only know they were in one area and find them being reported in another because they in fact had significant family or occupational links to that place. Now, I don't expect you to even try to read this, and you can understand why the newspapers online can be a problem. Now, this is another Ryan event, always the bane of my existence. But here we have James Ryan marrying Hannah Skinner. Now, James Ryan, how common is that? Both of his brothers are mentioned, John, Matthew, his father, Michael, his sister, Nora. Both of Hannah's sisters are mentioned by their married names, Mrs. Connor and Mrs. Timothy Galvin. So when we're looking for these common names and we know the family who surround them, the context in which they exist, and these marriages and death notices often give them to us, it's much easier to isolate the James Ryan or the Hannah Skinner we're looking for. And of course, we also get David Ryan there too. All of them have got, typical Irish names of that era. And it goes on to tell you all about their dress, all about their jewellery, etc. Remember, it was a different era. But they're not always accurate. We looked at FDG Stanley, but that's just a minor thing. Names can be seriously misspelled, and I know that people looking for German and Chinese ancestors and convict ancestors are absolutely, at many times, just frustrated with it. Significant personal events, dates and places can be misremembered, especially when the sources are second-hand and they always become more glamorous and romantic. Have you noticed? Never more mundane. A person's life is romanticised, events glossed over or enhanced. So they're not going to talk about the original arrival of a convict or a divorce. You cannot really trust newspapers unless you look at a lot of other records as well. You might think, why on earth is she carrying on about ships? Well, because, I've had people come in and say, it was definitely the name of this ship. And when you look at the names, not only can they never find it because they will only look for that spelling, but they're so far off. But when you look at them, you start to see why they go wrong. You need to listen to what they're saying. So the Cato Waddell became the Cuttawaddell. So you can see that the T's are softened to a D, and these are a lot of Germans on this one, and the C became a K. The Rajago Paul, which is, that's an Indian, belongs to the Indian subcontinent, became something French, which is more familiar. The Roger de Paul, except if you look by the Roger de Paul, you've got no hope of finding it. The Gauntlet became the Colette. And one where somebody refused to leave the counter until I found it, and he could never find it because he always put in the King of the Algiers, was the King of Algeria. But that's a simple one. And I've got 2 slides of it because it's obviously one of the ones that drives me mad. La Rochelle, in which Germans came, became more Germanic, and La Rochelle or La Rochelle or Lawrence Schiller. The Normahal, again a word of the Indian subcontinent, became the Norman Hall, so much more English. And one that I could not get till this woman rang me, it was the Louisa Tanya. Can anyone tell? Pardon? The Lusitania. And when do you think I actually picked that up? When I heard it, she rang me. It was about an Italian. She had, just that hint of an Italian accent. And she said, it's the Lusitania. Lusitania. Got it. Couldn't get it till that point. So you need to listen to the word, and you need to look at the things that are softened or changed into another language. So golden and diamond wedding notices can have almost biographies, when and how people met, how and when they travelled to Australia, details of their lives together, where they lived, their occupations, lists of descendants and photographs. And don't we all wish we've got them? Okay, now this picture is probably not doing justice to these people, and the only reason this slide is so densely packed is to show you that there can be quite a lot of information. I don't think you're going to be able to read it. But it's a golden wedding notice of Mr. and Mrs. Richard Hebbard, spelled Hebbard, and it says the ship was the Glen Oil. And of course it goes on about all those things that I've mentioned, but you will not find them under Hebbard or on the Glen Oil. You'll find them under Hibbard on the Glen Isla. But, that's a Scottish word, but, it wasn't a familiar word, obviously. Shipping intelligence. Obviously, this is one of the ones we all pore over, and certainly we index. It's got, that can have registers of incoming and outgoing overseas and coastal ships, names of cabin passengers, not always all of them either if it's a big list, reports on notable events which occurred during the voyage, like sickness and weather conditions, but they're not always accurate. If you compare the shipping records in the paper with the shipping records on the official lists of their arrival here, and now that we've got lists of their leaving England, amazingly they can all be different, which doesn't give you a lot of faith. And where do you trust your sources? You've obviously got to do a lot of comparisons. Okay, this is one that consumed quite a lot of our time. This was looking for an Ida Porsche Wheeler. Now, the staff member who did this, I think, deserves sainthood, Eileen Dwayne. We're trying to find Ida Porsche Wheeler, who travelled with a servant back to England. She was 7 years of age, and she, in fact, travelled on the Fiery Star, which had a very dramatic shipwreck. And the request came from England. There's an Ida Johns, there's a Miss W. Johns, and there's a Miss C. Johns. Then they tell us not long, they report the fact that they have got it wrong. We've been requested to make the following corrections to the manifest, and they add, to the passenger list should be added the names Miss C. Wheeler. Well, she was Ida Porsche Wheeler, but they still haven't got it right. After the ship is wrecked, this is their third go at it, they finally get Miss Ida Wheeler and the servant C. Johns. Now, somehow or other, C. Johns had become 3 Johns, and it took 3 attempts to get it. Can you see some of the problems we've got here? In other words, a lot of it doesn't always make sense. Accidents and inquests, they will often, report serious ones like mining accidents and house fires and automobile crashes. Some newspapers carefully followed them, depending on what other issues were pressing. And here we have Patrick Mooney, an elderly man, he was 51, having lied the year before and said he was 40 when he arrived. On last Monday afternoon, 5 miles from Brisbane on the Pine River Road, engaged in cutting down a tree with a cross-cut saw. It fell, striking against one near it. A branch from the cut tree was wrenched off and in falling struck Mooney on the forehead, fracturing the skull. Medical assistance was sent for without delay, but the wounded man died the same evening. An inquest was held on the body next day and a verdict of accidental death was returned. Now, we have the indexes to New South Wales inquests, and of course in 1851 we were part of New South Wales. All it records is accidental death, nothing else. He's not on the New South Wales deaths. He's listed at St Stephen's as having been buried by Father Downing. This is actually the only report of his death. Crime and punishment. You know, all those family embarrassments are a great thrill 50 or 60 years later because they'll get in the paper. All that drunkenness, you know, all the naughtiness, you know, even the murder people are pleased about, tragically, because it gives them some information. So theft, drunkenness, assault and murder are often reported, not necessarily in the place where they occurred, if they're concerned with embarrassing a family. But, of course, Trove gives us a chance to search more widely. Personal and social columns. Lots of community events and gossip. Parties. Someone who lived, you know, in the house where I'm now living came around some years, you know, ago, and she was an elderly woman, and she was standing outside, so we obviously called her in to have a look at the house. But these days, of course, now that you can search, I thought, well, I wonder what her life was like when she lived here. Her birthday parties are reported in the paper as a little girl. All her friends are listed. You've got their whole social network. I even found my father, who of course, if you believed him, had a deprived social life, not if you read the papers. The parties they had in their street were reported and all their guests were listed. It's a different world where people entertained at home and people were at home. And, you know, Mrs. So-and-so will be at home today. Mrs. So-and-so will not be at home today. Nobody would dare put that in the paper these days. But dances, balls, fetes, reunions, people popping into town even, or going to Redcliffe for 2 weeks. Their arrival was noted, when they left it was noted, and who needs CCTV in those days? Retirements, everything was there. You can pick up the flavour of what it was like to live in that period. So where do you search? Well, these days we just search very loosely on Trove, but death and marriage indexes can help to establish the date of an event. Electoral rolls establish where the research subjects could be living prior to the event, that is if they kept their records up to date. People like me, unfortunately, haven't always done that. Local cemetery records for deaths can also be useful. Consider local and nearby newspapers as well as those in the areas where the subject has lived over time. These are just some of the newspaper indexes we've got. Again, this is where searching on the catalogue at home, when you've got enough time to do it, you don't feel under pressure or you've got to put in an order by 1:30. And you can order some of these things if they're in closed access, some of these newspapers. And of course, one of them is the Ryerson Index, which you're going to hear about later. And what's particularly fantastic about that is the scope that it covers and the fact that it covers contemporary notices. We've got 35 info guides. That's only a small sample of them. And of course, some of them are outside. There are more in the reading room and more online. If we have a look at the top where it says website, resources, family history, info guides, this is called a breadcrumb trail. And very often this is an easy way to find your way around. Newspaper databases, free ones, Trove, we know about. And if you need to know more, I would certainly go and have a talk to the staff this afternoon. Papers Past, which is the New Zealand freebie. And of course, we know there was a lot of traffic between Australia and New Zealand, so most of us will find that very handy. On-site access only, but you need your library card, the British Newspaper Archive, which is like a British version of Trove, only nowhere near as good. Off-site with the Queensland Library card, 19th century British Library newspapers and Times Digital Archive. Now, we would obviously love to make as much as we could available, but the conditions of access are set by those who provide the databases. Newspaper digitisation. Many newspapers are obviously being digitised, and so you can see them on the web. We need to be aware of optical character recognition. So they have a means of trying to pick up the words, but in some cases you get nothing but gobbledygook. In many cases you are not getting the key words, so you know it's there, but you've got to keep trying different keywords to get it. So what most of us are doing is correcting. Excuse me. Then the text becomes keyword searchable much more easily. So if we find something for someone and we realise that they couldn't find it, like the name on a shipping list in the newspaper, we will often correct it. And I'm sure most of you correct keywords as well. And the trouble is, once you start, it becomes addictive. And we won't go into tagging, which is even more addictive. Advantages, flexible searching options. You can look right across different places and times and types of items. And you can try various sorts of search terms to get at what you want. In fact, it sometimes becomes a bit of a challenge, doesn't it? So one of the things of concern is that optical character recognition on microfilm can be unreliable. This is not helped by old newspapers in a deteriorated condition or poor filming before standards came into place. So that, as I've already mentioned before we began, the Toowoomba Chronicle is a problem for that reason. It's not that we don't consider the Toowoomba Chronicle vital to our existence. We know that it is. It's just that the film is not up to the standard we'd like it to be. But it's still possible to find what's there by trying various search terms and by correcting the text and searching widely to find items reported in other places. Now, on our home page, you can go to newspaper databases. We have a whole lot of aids to access for you, and Find will lead you to databases. And you can see the breadcrumb trail there, State Library website, resources, e-resources, which is just another name for all sorts of databases and websites. So you can see at the top of that our useful websites for family historians. Then you can see all the indexes that we've done over time, such as the convict transportation database, people call before government committees and whatever. And then e-resources, which can be accessed at home, and internal e-resources. If you click on those, you'll come to this. And then you can select which ones you want. And it tells you if it's on site at SLQ or if you can use a state library or a card. Our useful websites, which I've just mentioned, something we've lined up that you can search, and it will often take you to exactly the places like the index search or the catalogue search. But newspaper databases online, free, as we've said, is Trove, and that address will be certainly not only available on the computer but on your notes. Access free online with the State Library card, Times Digital, 19th Century British Library, and access free online on-site only with the library card, British Newspaper Archive, and there is the breadcrumb trail. Okay, we've already mentioned that an increasing number of those newspapers are becoming online with Trove. 1954, but we've already mentioned others have extended past that date, but generally because of copyright it goes just to 1954. We can search across states and time periods, includes the major dailies, regional papers, and it covers all text, including births, deaths and marriages. Many people are frustrated with newspaper databases because they do not cover the births, deaths and marriages. Allows for text correction, tagging and comments, and it allows for selective searching by various criteria. So you can find things you couldn't otherwise locate. Something which may not be in the Darling Downs paper may be in the Rockhampton paper. So a lot of new material is available and linked. And I'm going to give you an example. I always use advanced search. Everyone's got their preferences. You'll see these options that are available. Now, I want to find Alice Stanley, who married a Mr. Jennings. I was actually looking for her marriage notice in the paper. I'd given up on finding her death. I haven't put it in the phrase because I'm not sure Alice and Stanley will come together, and because it could be a problem. Maybe it will be Miss Stanley or whatever. I couldn't remember exactly when she'd married, and I really couldn't be bothered looking. So I put in 1875 to 1886. I didn't bother about the day or the month. You've got a rolling list of newspapers that cover the states. I didn't bother about selecting one because I know the Stanleys are reported in all the papers. I've selected only family notices, but sometimes I've noticed family notices come under advertisements as well. Where I've got article length, there are more options there than I've included because I wanted to get it onto the two screens. But can you see the options that are available? You can select by state, you can select by titles of the newspapers, you can select the length of the article, you can restrict it to illustrated items. And where I have sorted is by relevance. I could have sorted by earliest first or latest first. So you've got a lot to play with. Now, I was looking for her marriage, but because I took this wide, sort of careless search, I picked up her death. When I spoke to the family, they said, she married a Mr. Jennings and died in England. So we see how they married in Bath, in England, in 1875. But she was lost on board the SS Lyell Moon off Green Cape, New South Wales, on the evening of Sunday, 30th of May. Alice Susan, wife of R. Jennings, Esquire of Ringwood, Hampshire, England. Daughter of the late Montague Talbot Stanley, RSA. No Stanley is ever born, married or died without referring to Montague Talbot Stanley, RSA of Edinburgh. And the sister of FDG and H.C. Stanley of Brisbane, aged 42. So I'd accidentally picked up her death. But she died in a shipwreck, so pretty obviously I'm going to start looking for the shipwreck. And this was, of course, at the end of May. They've even got a map at this stage, and it's interesting. It's a glimpse of another time, the way it's reported. Among the incidents of the wreck, it may be mentioned that only one lady was on the deck of the forepart of the vessel. The third officer, Mr. Fotheringham, made a gallant attempt to take her to shore and had nearly succeeded when she was stuck with some floating debris and instantly killed. Her name has not been ascertained. But during the whole of this trial, the behaviour of the passengers and crew was exceedingly calm and brave. Even the lady who was unfortunately lost was quite collected and composed. She went to her watery grave stoically. And of course we can see there that it's right on the border of New South Wales and Victoria. People would get these boats up, the way we might get a plane over the weekend. And she was coming back from Melbourne and apparently had quite specifically wanted to go on the Lyell Moon. But the West Australian has reported it, and it talks about how the fortnight's been full of horrors. We'd hardly recovered from the shock of the loss of the Lyell Moon when the news of the terrific volcanic eruption in New Zealand reached us. And I'm just going to leap a bit here. The wreck of the Lyell Moon was full of pathetic incidents. Not the least sad feature of the wreck was that not one woman was saved. The only attempt made to save a woman was that of the third officer, Mr. Fotheringham, who did his utmost to save Mrs. Jennings but failed. This lady was on deck while all the rest were below, because of course she would have travelled cabin class. She was the intimate friend of the wife of a well-known medical man in Melbourne. The doctor and his wife saw her off in the Lyell Moon from Melbourne. The doctor's wife clasped a bracelet on Mrs. Jennings' arm as a parting gift. When the body was washed ashore at Green Cape, It was recognised by the bracelet still clasped on the arm. So we know what happened to her. But there is no death record, there is no inquest record. This is the only record. She's buried at Green Cape. The only body that was moved was that of Mary MacKillop's mother, Flora MacKillop. Her body was taken back to Sydney. British newspapers online, you can get the British angle on a number of things, from shipping, war, right through to local and family events. It gives us an opportunity to compare information and fill out detail. The Fiery Star, where they got the list wrong till the third attempt. Let's see what they had to say. Here is the list from a Brisbane paper in the London Times. Miss Ida Johns, Miss W. Johns, Miss C. Johns. And of course, Ida Porsche Wheeler, who came with her servant, Miss C. Johns, is missing. There were 3 lists. The first and most incorrect was the one they used, which explains why we were asked to look for it over 140 years later. So can you see the problems? Never just trust these reports alone. 19th century British newspapers, let's look for Mrs. Jennings. Obviously I tried the Lie Moon, which is the obvious thing to look for because it's different. I tried that, I tried Alice, I tried all sorts of things. But it was only Mrs. Jennings that worked because of OCR, optical character recognition problems. And the Hampshire paper reported it. The Australian papers give the name of Mrs. Jennings, wife of Mr. Reginald Jennings of this town, formerly Chief Clerk of the Department of Public Works, Brisbane, Queensland, as being amongst the 71 lives lost through the terrible calamity in the wreck of the Lie Moon, which took place off Green Cape on her way to Port Jackson. Mrs. Jennings, who was a most accomplished Englishwoman, she was in fact Scottish, endeared, even these sort of things get, I don't know how they would have coped with that, but they would have, endeared to many Australian friends, had been on an extended visit to the colonies, many years actually, and had chiefly resided of late with her brothers in Brisbane, Mr. Harry Stanley, Chief Engineer of Queensland Railways, and Mr. F. Stanley, late colonial architect of that colony. The Stanleys are a talented and accomplished family, and Mrs. Jennings inherited many gifts and graces that will with her be mournfully missed. So we get a bit more detail about her, that she's been on an extended visit to the colonies. We're also encountering here having to search by different terms that worked quite well in Trove, but don't work so well here. Then there's the British Newspaper Archive, which is, very much like our Trove, but not as good. You have to have a login. Once you've got your login, you can then search, and it says things like, "Hello, Stephanie," to you. So you can see you can choose a title, choose a region. And one of the people I wanted to look for was Morden Wright. He was a doctor, and his sons came up to northern Queensland mainly, and we're mining at Normanton. One of them was quite young, about 15, when he came out. What were all these young boys doing coming out to Queensland? I wanted to find out about his death, and obviously that's not going to be recorded in a Brisbane paper. And again, this could be very difficult to read, so I will tell you. At the top, it says parish doctor, and one of the guardians of the parish of St Mary Newington has committed suicide by taking prussic acid. They weren't worried about incorrect reporting. Now, when you look at all the items, and there's a stack of them because he was the parish doctor, he was the witness at I don't know how many post-mortems, or who gave the medical report. But then, of course, that's the Birmingham paper. In the London Standard, 2 days later it says, Mr. William Carter held an inquest in Woolworth on Saturday upon the body of Mr. Morden Wright, aged 50, a surgeon lately residing at number 31 Sturgeon Road, Surrey Gardens Estate, Newington, who died suddenly Monday evening. The coroner said this deceased gentleman had for many years was a parish doctor, and one of the guardians had been circulated that he had committed suicide by taking prussic acid. And so there was a post-mortem ordered, but in fact he had died from natural causes. But it is interesting to see. You'd be so careful these days to report it. But the effect of that was that their mother had already died, and there were these young boys in a time when, you know, there was very little social security came out as young men to try their luck on the goldfields. But to get to that story, you had to go to the English papers. And you also had to go through a lot of things on Morden Wright, because he was the parish doctor and was always in the paper. But they don't when you look at the highlights, it doesn't work as well as it does on Trove. It's not as easy to find. We've got 2 versions of the catalogue, and it's worth looking at both. One search is extremely good for finding pictures, for original documents, for getting online articles, which can be just so invaluable. The online catalogue, the former online catalogue, can be good for just titles of books and microform. You can, in some cases, request an item. You wouldn't be bothered requesting it if it's out on the open shelves, but if it's in a closed access and it has to be brought out, you can do that from home with your card. Both have got request an item options. If you want to look at Rocky newspapers, for example, the most accessible ones are going to be those on microform. They will not give them to you if they're on microform. Not everything is on microform. But note the huge variety of titles. There is more than the Rocky Morning Bulletin and its weekend version, the Capricornian. And there's all the other little things that are linked to it as well. This is one search, and here we're looking at cemetery indexes, and they have a little icon at the side which gives you an idea of how it might be available. Note here how to map your heritage. You can find the full text available. Now, to get at that, you're more than likely going to need your library card. But you can see there is a Kilcoy burial register, a Caboolture cemetery register. But we can do things, have a look at all the options that are around when you make a selection. Here we're looking at State Library. We could have selected other things like John Oxley or original materials or whatever. But we want to know what's in the whole of the library to do with cemeteries and images. And there's Paddington Cemetery, another view of Toowong Cemetery, and pictures of some of the graves, such as Margaret Euphemia Homan at Nunda. Okay, we're going to have to quickly finish. You can copy in the following ways. Scan a page on a computer and print. A4 is 15 cents, A3 is 30. Just do it with your library card. You can also save your document and email at home. You can save to a USB, but note the copyright conditions. You don't have to pay if you save it to a USB. It's certainly worth having a library card because you can order things from home. You have 3 hours access online. And getting things before you come in and having them ready when they're in closed access is very good and convenient. So newspapers are valuable. We've got a large collection of newspapers. Digitised newspapers are keyword searchable and now many flexible searching options. Online newspapers are increasing. What you see now is not necessarily what you're going to get in a couple of years. Published indexes, don't forget those for things which aren't on Trove, or even if they are on Trove. Sometimes you can find things that way you won't find anything else. But check a variety of sources to reduce error and extend the family story. And we provide a 2-hour research service. I think at this stage we'll skip the questions in favour of morning tea. We might not get back exactly at 1:15, maybe just a couple of minutes after, but as soon as possible after that would be really good. Well, Anne, of course we are. Of course we are.
Can I talk to you now?
Of course you can, yes. The Longreach Leader is online.
Yeah, well, that's what I think. I'm not really 100%.
I know.
It's well worth it. Yeah. But can I do that? Can I search Trove at home?
You can indeed, and it's free.
Yeah. Well, that's what I've got to learn to do.
Yes.
My problem is that I've had too many interests. But because I'm so badly hearing now, I'm stuck at home a lot.
Yeah.
I'm sitting there thinking that all this could get on an iPad. I could do it at night.
You've got an iPad.
Oh yeah, that's the best thing that ever happened to me.
Well, they are convenient. I find them a bit difficult. I prefer to have something a bit smaller, a bit bigger, sorry.
Well, yes, I know what you mean. But anyway, that's beside the point. Should you go now, or can I?
No, you talk to me. Yeah.
Well, I think I've talked to you about my family history project, and I've got a brand new four-drawer cabinet. It's nothing written; it's a collection. I've got it to the stage now, and I've got time to fine-tune it. It's all about grandfather and grandmother, who were pioneers of the Central West in the second half of the 1980s. But I'm not too sure really if I've got information which is helpful, which will be helpful to the library.
You know what I think you should do? Bring some of that in and we'll talk about it. But listen, you've got to have a cup of tea.
Yeah. Well, but could somebody just come out?